experience that, which is what he's getting to. So he's thinking of others. He's praying for their spiritual welfare. A great way to pray for your friends, for your family, for yourself too. And then the last thing I'd say is before we move on to the next verse is, I kneel before the Father. And I think as he was writing this, he probably wasn't kneeling as he was writing, but I think there were times when he prayed that he would literally kneel before the Father. And as he was chained to that Roman guard, he probably had to pull his chain over far enough so Paul, could kneel down before the Father. What a great testimony to witness to those guards as they would change shifts, taking turns being chained to Paul. That's not the reason he did it. But it was a great testimony because those guards and those people knew about kneeling, because they knew about court etiquette. As you go into the presence of a king in that day, we've probably seen it in the movies too. What happened? You bow, you kneel. You kneel to show honor, to show respect, to show authority, that you're submitting to that authority, and you kneel before that king. And Paul says, I kneel before the Father. So those soldiers knew exactly what he was doing. He was saying, my ultimate authority is before God. I kneel before the Father. This great priority that he placed on prayer. He goes on in verse 15, from whom his whole family in heaven and on earth derives its name. I mentioned this before, but Jesus, so very quickly, Jesus is the one that brings us all together. That's why we're here. He is the common bond we have as brothers and sisters in Christ. He is the one that has brought us together, even as two churches now, to become one for the purpose of advancing the gospel, for the purpose of doing kingdom work. He is the one that unites us, and we become family as brothers and sisters in Christ, from whom his whole family in heaven on earth derive its name. That they are united for the purpose of advancing the gospel. A number of years ago, I was reading an article from James Dobson, and he used an illustration that stuck with me. He told a story about a family in Nebraska years ago, 3 young children, and the family they grew corn, and he was a farmer. And they lived far out in the country, and they had neighbors, a community, but they were fairly far away. And as he tells this story, one afternoon while they were out in the yard playing, and the dad and mom were doing some work around the house, the temperatures were getting extremely hot and dangerously hot. And so early afternoon, they decided it was time to go in and to call the family in. And so they did so, and they got inside, and they realized that their youngest was not in the house. And so they went outside, and they started calling his name. And they didn't hear any response, and they went a little further down the road, and they started calling his name, and they weren't panicking yet in their voice. They went back in, maybe he's upstairs in his room, maybe he's in the backyard, but they still were unable to find him. Well, just a little bit of time passed, and you could hear in their voice that they started to become frantic and nervous because they were getting no response from him, and they didn't know where he was. The cornfields, hundreds of acres, surrounded their home. Their fear was that he had wandered off into the cornfield. And so they called some neighbors, and some neighbors came down, and they started looking, and they started calling his name. And now an hour had passed, and then 2 hours, and then they had called the police department. They had come out, and some of the fire and rescue. The town came together because they were all helping to look and to seek and to find this young boy who were calling out to him. Calling out. Nightfall came in, and they had not found him. They lit up the cornfields the best they could. Temperatures soared past 100. Dangerous heat restricted their search and rescue efforts. They searched through the night to no avail. The next morning, they assembled everybody. By this time, hundreds of people from the town had come. All the police department and fire and rescue were there to help find this young boy. And as they gathered for this group meeting to try to determine their next course of action, one of the men said, hey, how about if we do this? How about it? We have so many people here. How about if we line up along this cornfield right here that goes as far as the eye can see, and we line up about this far apart in a big human line. We join hands, and then we start walking through the cornfield. That way we're covering every step. Let's try it. So as he writes, they all joined hands, and as far as the eye could see, all the way down, there were people. And all the way down this way, there were people joining hands. And the call was made to start walking through, and hand in hand they started to walk through the cornfields 50 yards, 75 yards, 100 yards, 150 yards. And right as they hit about that 200-yard mark, they felt change start. And they looked over here to the left, way as far down as you could see. And you saw people rushing and gathering, and they were waving their arms. They were waving their arms. And they found him. But because of the heat, his body couldn't handle it. Sometime in the night, he passed away. And walking back to the house, one of the rescue workers said, I wish we would have joined hands sooner. If we had, maybe we would have found him alive. And that's what we are doing as we become one church. Is we see the bigger picture. Is to advance the gospel. The bigger picture is to reach more people. It's not just to get to a certain point to be comfortable. I mean, let me just remind you, GracePointe family, that God has brought us all together for the purpose of advancing the gospel, to use the facilities He's given us for kingdom purposes. It's not just to say, wow, this is great. We can have comfortable surroundings to worship. We have more space. And all those things are true, but it's all we engage. That's all for the purpose of advancing the gospel for the glory of His name. And that's our focus. That's keeping the main thing the main thing. He says, from whom His whole family in heaven and on earth derive its name. He goes on, verse 16, and he says in this prayer, as he is beginning now, verse 16, I pray that out of His glorious riches He may strengthen you with power through His Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have the power together with all the saints to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ. Let's go back to verse 16. This, and I know there's not time to show you the details of it. I wish I could, but I know this is a progressive prayer. They build on each other, with the pinnacle being in verse 20, 21, for the glory of His name. But each one, if you go back and read it, you'll see progressively they build on each other. I pray that out of His glorious riches, so it's not anything you're doing, He may strengthen you with power through His Spirit in your inner being. So it's transformation, not reformation. Reformation is from the outside in. It's just trying to change your behavior to be good. And that's a great effort, but that's not how change works in Christ. He transforms us in our heart, and then that's manifested through our behavior. You see, that first starts in our heart, dwelling. Christ dwelling, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. So it means to settle down, to dwell there, to meditate on this. We talked about last week in Joshua where the Lord told him not to go to the left or to the right. Don't be distracted. Keep the main focus and the main thing, and that happens through meditating on the Word day and night. Dwelling on the Word and in your relationship with Christ. As one writer says it this way, I want that which is inside of you, what you possess as believers, to get on the outside of you. I want people to look at you as you live your life and let them see you have a divine ability that is working inside of you. I want it to be